Morning, everybody. I'll call this work session to order. It's October 5th, 2023. This is a work session regarding AO 2023-101, an ordinance of the Anchorage Assembly, repealing and replacing Anchorage Municipal Code, Chapter 3.30, Part 19, Rule 19, Personnel Rules, to conform the substance misuse testing of employees to federal and state regulations and provide the Human Resource Department authority to establish procedures for substance misuse testing and necessary to publish interim guidance to employees and supervisors. So we're here today for probably our third meeting to discuss this ordinance. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to just, again, on the record, make a disclosure. I work for a nonprofit that provides drug and alcohol treatment services. And so I have some 20 plus years of experience in the field. And so it's an area of interest to me and an area of expertise. But nowhere within this ordinance is there a requirement or an offer of a deal or any funding for treatment services. And so this is really working at the principal level of treatment should be available. And in fact, treatment is available in the code already for those who self-report before a test comes positive. And so this just changes the point in time when that would be an option for an individual. And so I believe I don't have a conflict. I don't know that I need a ruling, but if anyone objects, we can have that discussion. Okay, I'm not hearing any discussion. I will once again make this disclosure next week on Tuesday before the public hearing. And I'll be prepared then as well to have a discussion. So for the purposes of today's meeting, the workflow is going to be, I will walk through a proposal, then we will hear from HR. We'll have a discussion among the members and have at least one individual from the workforce who has expressed interest in testifying before us or giving us input on the ordinance. So I want everyone to understand that this is a work in progress. It doesn't stand before you as a final document. It will come forward. We will come forward with a substitute version, hopefully by Tuesday, that will incorporate the concerns and inputs that we hear today from the HR department, from members that might have some, and also additional changes that have already been identified in the drafting process. And so with that, for the purpose of today's meeting, I'm going to hand the gavel to Mr. Martinez. We'll do introductions and then I'll make the presentation. So Mr. Cross. Introductions.
Kevin Cross.
Karen Bronga. Anna Brawley.
Scott Myerson. Daniel Voland.
George Martinez.
Christopher Constant.
Tyler Andrews.
Raylene Griffith.
Good morning, Kent Colhays.
We have DNS as
We
well.
are joined by DNS, an attorney, and we are joined by municipal attorney staff, the assembly attorney staff as well, Mr. Gates and Mr. Hurt.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into the presentation. AO 2023
Yeah, Randy Salt on the phone.
Sorry.
Thank you, Randy. Randy Salt on the phone.
Thank you. Let's head to the next slide. So fundamentally, the project starts with the fact that this is a repeal and replace project. So what it does is it eliminates the current and existing section 330-190 and replaces it with a new code. So for that reason, you won't see markup language in the draft. Why are we updating AMC 330-190? Why am I proposing this? The update to this policy is long overdue. For the most part, it hasn't changed since 1999. It addresses concerns of fairness by modernizing the code. The proposal removes unnecessary barriers to employment by narrowing testing to those required by federal and state policy. It shifts to a healthcare approach of managing drug and alcohol issues in the workforce. It addresses the concerns of the Ombudsman's report, OM 2023-0012. while also reflecting the current status of legalization of marijuana in the municipality. Next slide, please, Justin. What does it do, though? Who gets tested? Under this ordinance, both covered and uncovered employees, which we'll talk about more, will be tested under certain circumstances. What gets tested? Under the current draft, it's urinalysis, oral fluids, and blood, subject to change. Where will they get tested? At a professional lab under contract with the municipality that currently exists. Ooh, there's a little mistake. When will they get tested? Depending on whether they're covered or uncovered, it'll be pre-appointment, random, for cause, or when accidents occur. Why they get tested? Compliance with federal and state laws and policies, and to ensure workforce safety. And how they get tested again, UA, oral oral fluids, or blood in the current draft. So the public hearing on this item is set for Tuesday. Let's go to the next slide. It's who gets tested. Under the new ordinance, employee means any person in the employment of the municipality whose activities are directed by the municipality. We create two classifications: covered employees and non-covered employees. Covered employees mean only those classes of employees who are subject to drug testing as required by Titles 14 and 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations, those who are subject to reporting and regulation under the Alaska Police Standards Council, and any other mandatory federal or state drug testing requirements. So individuals who might fall. So the code provides a place if there is an additional requirement that we somehow missed or one future arises, that those individuals will be classified as covered. Non-covered employees means everyone else. And so specifically what that means in the municipality at this time, it would mean anybody who has a commercial driver's license or anybody who works under a grant from the Federal Transit Authority, who in the Federal Transit Authority work has anything to do with the conduct of our transit function, which according to FTA includes everybody who turns a wrench on a wheel, blows up a tire with air, drives the bus, anyone who's manually doing the work on the transit equipment that we are grant funded for. So then the police, because the Police Standards Council. Everyone else generally would fall under the non-covered employee category. So what gets tested for? The code establishes prohibited drugs means substances listed under Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 of the Controlled Substances Act and published in 21 CFR 1308.11 and 21 CFR 1308.12. And we have that list. It's not a comprehensively long list. It's about 6 substances. In the current draft, we provide that testing for the presence of marijuana shall be through collection of saliva, blood, or urine specimens. The tested employee shall have the right to choose. So I note on the bottom there that a substitute version is in development because I have done an extensive literature review of the science on this. And the science is just really making the case, if your intent is to capture individuals who may be intoxicated at work, using at work, then the urinalysis is not a test that will ever do that. It's not possible to capture that. In fact, the urinalysis only captures the presence of metabolites, which can last in the body for 90 days. There's no real good threshold there. So in a substitute version, we will probably remove urine from the current test for non-covered employees. So also blood. I have been in discussions with our testing company. The testing system that they use for saliva is a gas chromatography, which is the highest level of validity that's available. And so I believe in the final version we're going to come forward with, it's going to narrow the options right on down to the saliva test, which eliminates then the argument of employees feeling like they should give a blood sample who are not part of the covered status. Where will employees get tested? So back in February, we approved an amendment to the contract to Beacon Occupational Health and Safety. So Beacon is our current provider of testing for human resources for drug and alcohols. So I am including there, if you look close, it's a little small font, an email that I have with the testing administrators at Beacon on the 18th of September. And I just asked, let me just restate my understanding so you can confirm my assumptions. 1, Beacon can set custom cutoffs for urine and oral fluids, i.e. urinalysis at 200 nanograms per milliliter or oral fluids at 25 nanograms per milliliter. 2, custom tests will take a few days to generate the first test, but after that, the tests will be available on short notice. 3, saliva tests can be set to test solely for delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol and specifically exclude any other metabolites, and that Beacon does not perform blood tests. The response from Katie Broderick, who's the Drug and Alcohol Program Administrator for Beacon in Anchorage, said, "Good morning, correct to all 4 questions." So we know that Beacon can provide testing at a custom level, 25 nanograms per milliliter of saliva test. I also had follow-up with them and asked, do you do the kind of simple test that's like the COVID test where you have the drop of fluid and it runs across and you get 2 lines if it's positive? Those are not very reliable tests. And they said, we don't do that for saliva. We only do that for UAs. And so practically speaking, the test that they use is the highest validity test that's available. And ultimately, simply, Beacon has said in writing, they can adjust their process. Now, let's discuss what it does with employees and when they are tested. So for all employees, covered or non-covered, if there is reasonable suspicion, testing shall be conducted when a supervisor determines there are reasonable and specific grounds to believe that the poor performance or unsafe acts of an employee are due to substance misuse. This is in the old code. This is ported forward into the new code. There is some discussion about coming up with a better benchmark for what establishes reasonable suspicion, because you don't want to have a case where an individual supervisor is just deciding I have reasonable suspicion because they don't like a person. But that said, there is a checklist that exists, and there's a conversation about improving that checklist. Second, post-accident. Following a work-related accident, each employee directly involved in or contributing to the accident shall be tested for alcohol and drugs when the accident involved, 1, the loss of human life, 2, bodily injury to any person who, as a result of the injury, immediately requires medical treatment away from the scene. They're taken away in an ambulance. Or 3, one or more vehicles incurs disabling damage as a result of the accident, requiring the motor vehicle to be transported away from the scene by a tow truck. So the current standard in the code is $500 of damage to a vehicle you must test. So most of us recognize $500 from a vehicle could happen if you spill a Coca-Cola and leave it on your paint too long. It's anything is $500. So it's an irrational standard. We should just say all accidents will be tested, or we come up with a better standard. This standard is actually the standard that US DOT has in their code. So this is the federal standard, and it's a good standard. So also work-related accidents, this section may come out involving that do not involve loss of human life will only require testing if the employee receives a citation. The issue of a citation is very interesting, and it's an area we're still in discussion about. It's in this draft. I thought we removed it, but we didn't. And so it may come out in a substitute version. So then part B there is testing specific to covered employees. Only those employees classified as covered shall be subject to testing under these rules. It's pre-employment. It's a non-covered employee who transfers or promoted, demoted, or hired, rehired, reinstated to a covered position. Failure to take and successfully pass the test shall disqualify the applicant, but not and successfully pass the test shall disqualify the applicant. We'll come back to that in relationship to the ombudsman's report. And then random testing shall only be applicable to those employees required by federal or state government regulations and will be administered in accordance with federal and state regulations. The Alaska Supreme Court has in fact ruled a narrowing of the random drug testing. And so we can't just randomly test all of our covered employees. So that's just in alignment with the Alaska Supreme Court. So next we get to what we talked about briefly yesterday. What happens when an employee tests positive? Currently in the code, they're fired. Except alcohol. You can have a little alcohol in your system, apparently, according to the code as it exists right now. But any of the drugs, you are fired. That's just it. You shall be terminated. So the new code proposes, as I discussed yesterday, that we allow what's currently in the code since 1979, updated last in 1986, are forms of progressive discipline that we will allow employees to go through and require, in fact, employees to go through a progressive discipline process with their supervisor. It may be argued that we have that termination rule because it's the federal requirement, but in fact, I have USDOT Rule 49 CFR Part 40, Section 40.23 here. It doesn't say that. It says, as an employer, when an employee has a verified positive, adulterated, or substituted test, or has otherwise violated a DOT agency drug and alcohol regulation, you must not return the employee to performance of safety-sensitive functions until or unless the employee successfully completes the return to duty process of subpart O of this part. So clearly it's stated in the federal law and the code that employees can be returned to work. And so our code is far away from that currently. And if you wonder what part O is, it basically states that before an employer allows a driver to return to duty to perform a safety sensitive function after the driver has violated prohibitions of 49 CFR 382, the driver must first be evaluated by a substance abuse professional, participate in or complete the treatment program prescribed by the substance abuse professional, pass a drug and alcohol return to duty test, and then have documented follow-up. And so effectively, the federal law allows it, and I've just provided you the references you need to get there. So why do employees get tested? The argument has long been that it's to keep the workforce safe and the work safe in our municipality. And I agree with that. I don't have any disagreement. But specifically, the US DOT requires federal contractors and all federal grantees to establish and maintain a drug-free workplace policy. So when you read that policy, it doesn't say anywhere you are required to have testing of all of your employees. It says you are required to test the employees who fall under the federal definition of safety sensitive, which are those individuals who have a CDL driver's license or drive for the Federal Transit Authority or work on buses. And so if there's some suggestion that it's a concern for the municipality because we are a subcontractor, a contractor, or a grantee, or a direct recipient of funding from the feds FTA, I have here for you from the October 2022 FTA Drug and Alcohol Regulation Updates Issue Number 76 statement that says, quote, if an employee of a recipient of Chapter 53 funds performs a safety sensitive function, the employee would be subject to FTA drug and alcohol testing. Those funds that we receive or may receive are urbanized area formula grants, capital investment grants, and formula for grants for other than urbanized areas. And so clearly our employees who work for transit would fall under the requirement of a safety sensitive function, but it wouldn't require, say, an attorney working for the assembly or a desk worker at the Parks and Rec department to be tested by virtue of the FTA's grant funding to us. And then finally, again, the statement from the Alaska Police Standards Council in February of 2015, following legalization of recreational marijuana in Alaska, the Alaska Police Standards Council examined the applicable state regulations prohibiting certified police, corrections, probation, parole, and municipal corrections officers from using or consuming marijuana and determining by a unanimous vote that the regulations should and would remain unchanged, which means individuals are sworn and who are kind of provided their law enforcement status under the Alaska Police Standards Council may not participate in legal marijuana. Therefore, they're subject to testing. Finally, what about the research? So I have an extensive body of literature that I've reviewed. I wish I could share all of this with you, to quote someone from the administration last week. It's a lot of reading. It's a bit overwhelming. But the general takeaway that I've had from reading and also from having an interview with the key researchers who kept popping up in a number of these studies that have been published and peer-reviewed is that per se levels have value, but limited value. Per se levels are the nanograms per milliliter because individuals who use cannabis might have a tolerance that's built up. And interestingly, intoxication, signs of intoxication are very difficult to test via biomarker, which is a urinalysis test or the saliva test or the UA, but it's actually really the best case scenario to have behavioral tests that are coupled with the per se test. If you reasonably suspect someone and you give them a test and they show positive, then you have a positive test. That's hard though, because there isn't really a great validated behavioral test. I personally go to a place that I know my HR friends don't like, that supervisors should in fact know how their employees conduct themselves on a regular basis and should know when they're acting in a manner that is inconsistent with the norm. And then it could be that they're having a diabetic issue and they're starting to act in a very strange way, or it could be that they are intoxicated and that would warrant a test. We don't have that information at this time. A second factor that really rose up is that training is the key to success of compliance, that we have to train our workforce to understand the rules and the methods and what is allowable and what's not allowed. And so that's not in this ordinance, but it may show up in the S version, and it may require a fiscal note to provide the HR department the means to test across the workforce. And so I'm chewing on that and looking for a funding source, but it is demonstrated by the data that that's a very high value. And then there is actually one exceptional measure that has been validated over time and consistently for demonstration of intoxication relative to marijuana use in particular, and that is the time since last use. When did they last use? There's data that shows it's about 2.5 to 5 hours for inhaled cannabis and about 5 hours to about 8 hours for oral consumption. And so what's not in the document, but I am close to drafting in the substitute version, is what's normally kind of considered in the aviation business, what they call the bottle to throttle limit, which is a demonstration in the code of a time from last use to when you go on shift, so that we create a really bright line standard for our workforce so that there's no ambiguity that you should have stopped then why did you do this an hour ago? You're showing signs of intoxication. We're going to test. And so that really gets me through the body of my presentation. What's next? We're going to finalize the substitute version, including inputs we hear today from the HR department, anything from the members, updates as a result of the literature review and the interview that I had yesterday with Mr. Hurt and some of the primary researchers down in Australia, which was quite a bright conversation. We'll have our public hearing and hopefully passage next week, and then we will develop an educational component to ensure a smooth and successful implementation and hopefully move towards improved recruitment and retention of our workforce and have a more fair and equitable system of managing substance use disorder issues in the municipality. So that's my presentation. It took me a little bit. Now, let's have a conversation.
Oh, thank you, Chair Constant, for the presentation. You mentioned at the start that then we would next hear from HR. And is that the order of the operations?
Ready to go.
Yeah, so we're ready to go with HR, and then we'll have it open for discussion with the members. Cool, great.
Thank you. Tyler Andrews, Human Resource Director. So I have a little bit of an opening statement, and then we'd like to talk about some of our concerns, and we'll be following the AO. That was the best roadmap for us to kind of dissect what was going on. So thank you again for the opportunity to participate. I'd like to set a little bit of context around some numbers. So in the last 4 complete calendar years, excluding 2023, the post-accident testing program has tested anywhere from 117 to 298 employees following an accident event. Positive tests over that period have ranged from 0 to 6, with the positive rate in the biggest year of testing, 298, was approximately 2% of all folks tested positive. In that year, and I think it's kind of worth looking at, about 0.007% of those folks, so less than 1%, tested for illegal substances other than marijuana. About 0.007% tested for marijuana alone, and then about 0.007, the rounding is off, right? Tested for 2 or more. So in that year where we had 298, there were 6 positives, and they kind of spanned that spectrum of illegal, marijuana alone, or 2 or more. So that was 6 people, 2% of that whole population of folks that got tested. It's good to remember we don't, except for the CDL folks, the vast majority of people we're talking here are not in a universal random program. The municipality doesn't have one of those. There are employers in town that have them. We don't have that. Exclusive of CDL holders and those kinds of folks that have to be in a random pool, which I think most folks are familiar with. I think in many ways, the administration views this program as a risk management and safety program. I want to assure people it is not designed to be a gotcha, get rid of employees type program. That's not why we have it. I think we all, while we prefer no change, obviously we all have to acknowledge that the law in our state changed some time ago. And so some response to that is required. Speaking for the administration, our preferred alternative would be to simply address the testing level for non-covered folks using marijuana. I think that would be a very elegant solution. We could leave much of the program undisturbed. So that would be a very elegant way to get to a solution that acknowledges that marijuana is legal in our state. So we wanted to make sure that you heard from us that we thought there was a different alternative.
Could I ask a quick clarifying question?
Sure.
So I don't necessarily disagree with you because that is where this all started, but the current testing program tests for all drugs. What you're suggesting is just eliminate marijuana from the panel. or changed it so that.
Adjust marijuana in the panel. Yeah. Obviously, the other substances, based on the statistics I just shared with you, could have an impact. And I think I don't think we're disagreeing that we have a super legitimate basis to respond to the change in law that occurred some time ago.
That's,
So-
I just want to make sure there was the difference of all those drugs to the marijuana only.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I actually caught myself when I wrote this, so I had to go back and check that. But our other goal here is if there must be change, then we want to work with making that change so that it can be, we can be administratively effective. We can be compliant with our federal programs and the Alaska Police Standards Council. And we also need to provide time for implementation and budgeting these education activities. If we are going to be more involved in treatment, which we really aren't, and I think we should have a good discussion about that. Those things take staff time and attention, and sometimes they take budget. And I understand the desire to have a treatment model. I can tell you just from my own history, years ago, employers were very much more involved in that. And then we kind of realized that we were being a bit paternalistic, and really the thing to do was when you got the positive, you direct the employee to the resources and get out of their life, right? I mean, I had a job one time where I had to call up and say, hey, did Joe show up for his randoms? Oh, no, he didn't. Well, then the employer has to act on that because he's got a treatment contract with us and he's supposed to have 6 randoms over the next 12 months. Why did you let him skip number 3? And I find it invasive, but this would, I think, potentially cause us to change. And I'm not saying we can't change. There's a little perspective there. Anyway, so with that, please, again, we appreciate the opportunity. Please consider our comments as constructive and not obstructionist. And so with that, I can just keep marching along if that's okay. All right. Sure.
This information. Could I ask a quick one?
Yes.
Thanks. So you gave a number of 117 to 298 employees. Was that annually?
Yes. For post-accident only, right?
And then the 0 to 6, do you have a total aggregate number of tests over those 4 years?
I did not aggregate that. I just gave you the range. So in the lowest year, so this is 22, 21, 20, and 19, I believe. And the lowest year was 117. The highest year, 298. We can get you those stats if you want.
Yeah, I just would love to know how many positives we had in the context of a conversation about
So in
alternatives.
the year when we did 298 tests, we had six positives. That was what I shared with you as far as approximately 0.7, almost 1%, were marijuana. The other group was folks who just deal illegal things. That was 0.7, and then we had the 2 or more folks.
Right. So that those percentages are difficult to consume, but if in the biggest year it was 6 and the smallest year it was 0, then we're talking 18 or fewer people over a 4-year period, right?
Actually, thanks, Raylene. We are talking, no, even less than that. We're talking exclusive. I'm not using this year's stats because we haven't completed, but we're talking 6 people in 22, 2 people in 2020, 1 person in 19. So that would be 9
Thank you.
over that period.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, we have a question now that we can go from Member Brawley, and then we'll start a queue as well to see if we can get through the presentation.
Yeah, thank you. I had a couple kind of context questions before we get too far into the policy. One is, so as I understand it, it sounds like alcohol there is, it's not an automatic firing. Is that right?
That is correct.
And then what about legal opioids? Like things like painkillers? Is there a way
Well,
to
that's going to be, it all depends if we're in the CDL, the covered employee environment, right? Then the medical review officer, before we ever get the result, the medical review officer calls the person who gave the sample and says, hey, we found this in your sample. Do you have a prescription for it? Right. And as soon as they provide the documentation, then that's reported as a negative. And for non-covered employees, we follow the same process, right? So if they have a prescription, then we don't even see it, right? It's a non-event. It's a negative, right? So that's very standard drug and alcohol testing protocol. Yep.
Yeah, and part of my point is just to point out there's the legal framework of what's allowed or not, and then there's the substances that impact your ability to do your job or drive or whatever, and those are two different categories, and it's helpful to keep those distinct, I think. And then the other question, so I know we're self-insured, so I wondered what if any existing employee assistance program we have, and those are the programs where, for example, if somebody does have an issue, and maybe it's not even addiction, maybe it's some other issue that their manager can refer them to. It's a private, separate program, and then just generally, kind of what is our treatment coverage within our health program?
Last question, I do not know the exact answer to. The basic process is this. For a person that self-reports, or maybe their boss says, hey, you're not working like you used to, what's up? They go to the EAP, then the EAP turns around and makes a referral to the appropriate substance abuse professional to do an assessment there. The employer's entirely unaware of this. It just happens that way, which I think is preferable. Unless, of course, there's some other event that results in discipline or something like that. But if the person just self-reports and says, hey, I think I need some help, they can use the EAP. But then the EAP does not deliver substance abuse services. They make a referral to the appropriate provider and then goes from there, right?
Thank you. And I just wanted to, again, put some context there, because I know we're talking about drug testing, but we're also talking about treating addiction and potentially so.
Sure.
Mr. Cross?
Yeah, and thank you. And I had two questions, and Anna hit my second one, which was just since recent findings have allocated addiction towards a medical issue, how when someone self-reports, is that handled by insurance? So that was another question I would like more information. The other one I have in here is not just how we currently handle it, but also whether the verbiage in here is correct. So just looking at a post-accident, okay? It says if someone receives a citation or there is a motor vehicle incurring damages, that there is a test. And then, but it says when an employee self-reports a substance misuse prior to taking a substance misuse test and results in a positive and enters into an educational. So I'm kind of curious about this window, because it doesn't say if the event occurs and there's a window before test, if they self-report. It just says if they self-report before testing, right? But what if there's an event and they self-report before they're tested because of the event? Is there are you really self-reporting, or did you get yourself into a corner where it's like, okay, now you're getting tested, so you're coming forward before testing? I mean,
So I can speak to how we do it now.
Please,
and I
thank you.
think there is a change in the proposed legislation, but now basically once we're headed for the test, the self-report window is closed, right? And that is typical with lots of employers. Typically, you want the self-report to happen well in advance of the vehicle crash or what have you. I think that's one of our concerns here is we think the legislation may change that, and we'd like to see that. It would be helpful to have that adjusted. Again, it's not intended to be a gotcha program, but it's also, you know what? There's nothing better than seeing a person come forward and say, hey, I'm messing up and I need some help. And I think we all need to honor that. And it's terrific, right? That's the first step for a big change for somebody. And I think we should all be proud of them for doing that. The tough part is when we've already got a mess, we've already got a vehicle or a person who's injured, and we've got to take that seriously as well. And I think I'm speaking as a human here, need to balance the compassion and the accountability. And I think they have to go together, right? And as an employer, unfortunately, we get put in that spot sometimes. So I'm going on. I'm sorry. Probably
No.
over answering.
So, and then that might be something to do. So on page 7, we've got paragraph 3, but it starts lines 32. There's section A. When an employee self-reports a substance misuse prior to taking a substance misuse test, we might put something in there, but I don't know if within 45 days of a reported accident, or I'll have to think about how we verbiage that. But I don't want this to be, I don't think that was the intention. I think that's just, it's important that we say that if there's an accident, if you self-report before you're tested, that's excluded. So post an accident within 45 days or whatever that looks like. I'd appreciate it. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. I think the only real change there is they won't be fired automatically. They will be run through a process of progressive discipline. If somebody is in an accident and a vehicle is disabled and they have a positive test, because we assume under this condition that the test will happen, self-report or not, because of that triggering event, then the real difference is, no, you won't necessarily just be terminated. We're going to have your supervisor ask, how did this happen? Why did this happen? What's going on? Have you been a great employee? We're going to work with you. What does the EAP say? Go get your assessment. If it says, no, you aren't really warranted for treatment, we'll go from there, right? So that's what changes here. It's not so much the testing. Mr. Hurt?
Thank you for the chair. I just wanted to point out that language was pulled verbatim from existing code language in section 1910, the return to duty and follow-up testing. So it actually doesn't change anything. It's pulled from.
Right. The real change is you won't be fired automatically if there is a positive test. You will be given an option, worked with your supervisor.
Member Bronca?
So I was looking up the difference between an oral test and the urine test, and I know nothing about this, but there was like a little checklist I saw, and it said that the urine can test for illicit drugs and maybe like the painkillers, medications, and they did not have that on the list for saliva. So I'm wondering if that's accurate, and if an oral test would be a good enough measure.
Yeah, so oral tests can test for any of these chemicals depending on the testing lab. A gas chromatography system, which is what Beacon uses, is able to subdivide very finely the chemicals that exist by weight, is how it basically does it, weight of the gas. And so the problem with urinalysis test is it only tests for the metabolites. The metabolites are what the THC breaks down into in your body after you consume. It does not demonstrate the presence of active THC, which is the substance that we're talking about. Now, the studies also demonstrate that use outside of work, people on their own time, does not have a net impact on the workforce, meaning the studies demonstrate it doesn't create an increase in risk. Cannabis users who don't use at work. There is a risk that has shown when people are actively intoxicated at work, which is what we're aiming for, is to figure out how to keep them from being intoxicated at work, the drug-free workplace concept. And so it's irrational in the end to use the urinalysis test because it can't do that. It can only do the metabolites. And I can show you the studies if you want. I've highlighted the germane sections when we're done here. And so for the covered employees who have a standard that says you cannot use these substances in any way, the urine test is fine because it will show within the last week, month, 90 days, whether or not you have had THC in your system because of the metabolites that exist. But for the purposes of demonstrating active intoxication, the urinalysis can't do it. And so there are like the basic, almost like the COVID tests for THC, but those, well, they will use a stick at the testing company, but it's how they review the system that makes the difference, how they review the chemicals that makes the difference, substances. Those basic tests, POC, point of contact, the ones that are often done in other jurisdictions by police when they pull over a driver, they're just basic very simple and not very effective. But our testing company doesn't do that. And so practically speaking, I can give you plenty of detail on why your analysis is fine for covered employees, but it's not okay for non-covered.
Mr. Tyler?
Thank you. So you caught one of our issues, I think, and we weren't aware of that it may have been from code, but yeah, we're concerned about that. So some of our general points as we go through the AO, we want to make sure that we don't have FTA funding impact. We've sent the proposed legislation to them to ask for a review. And that is part of our triennial process with them. They have previously commented on our existing policy and suggested about 5 or 6 things that we need to fix to meet their requirements. So if we can get them to look at it in advance, I think it'd be very helpful. I understand that we've got a lot of language that says, hey, if it's not in compliance with federal law, I think they're going to look for something a little bit more specific rather than kind of just a blanket, yeah, we'll fix it if it's not in compliance with your statute. So hopefully they can get it back to us and help us construct something that works and keeps us in compliance. So we move forward on that. With the CDL employees, you're right. Our current process works as you describe. We do have, once they test positive, right, they are unable to work until they go through all those steps. In our current process, correct me if I'm wrong, because of the separation, they do those steps on their own, right? And if they are successful and they reapply, we can rehire them. So this puts us much more involved because once they have the event, we have to report that to what's called the clearinghouse, right? So there's a federal clearinghouse for all those CDL holders that says, what's the status of their license? Do they have any infractions? Do they have any drug problems? Blah, 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 blah. And that doesn't get cleared, they can't work, right? So this does change how we deal with that scenario. Is that change good, bad, or otherwise? I just want to make sure you know it's a significant change. Because,
Jump in real quick.
right.
Mr. Constant?
One thing that this ordinance does specifically on the question of rehire is it takes the bar of being rehired for 1 year and moves it to 6 months. So currently under the code, if you have a positive test, you're fired and you can't reapply for a year. And so this shifts it to 6 months. And the burden we're talking about of getting much into people's lives, if the argument is you can keep your job, you just got to go do these things for 6 people or 2 people in a year, seems pretty manageable. But anyhow, we go from 6 months, 1 year to 6 months is the mandatory no hire period.
Okay. So then as we go through the AO, just trying to hit the highlights here. You already heard what we felt about the self-reporting. We want to make sure that I appreciate, by the way, your so I'm on page 6, which covers the whole issue with saliva testing. Like I told you on the phone, seems like we might be talking to 2 different people at Beacon. Your email seems quite definitive on what they say they can do. We're going to need to get some time to negotiate that into the agreement to make sure that if they're going to be able to provide that, they make the service level commitments that says they're going to be able to do that. And then page 6, 33 through 36, which has to do with the supervisors. We'd like to see that discretion differently. Our concern is ending up with multiple standards across the municipality. If one agency says, hey, we don't think this is a big issue, and then another agency says, and I'm not talking about the CDL holders or the law enforcement folks. So in that area, you've deferred quite a bit to the operational units about whether they're going to test or not. We
Can you
would
point us to the line specifically? You said the line number doesn't match.
Hang
What
on.
page and what line?
on the AO page 6 of 10. This one. That's not the one I'm concerned about. Just a moment.
They're looking, I can't speak to that. This might be just a difference of opinion and policy. It's one that we wrestled over a little bit in the early parts of the drafting. I personally believe, and we have drafted it in such a way that generally speaking, those major decisions are made by the department head of the supervising department instead of in the HR department. And so instead, it's in consultation with the HR director, the department head of the supervising department will make the determinations. So there is an argument that's been made, and it's not irrational, that we would like to keep the decision-making process uniform. But what uniformity has gotten us to is a policy where you must be fired. And it's not fair to me. And so what we've done is attempt to restore the supervisory chain of command to the department head of the department who actually is doing the work. Then the argument is, well, how do we make sure this doesn't mean in one department you'll get laissez-faire or lenient treatment, in one department you'll get strict treatment, which then creates an equal protection argument. And the argument back from that I have, and you guys can choose to consume this in whatever way you choose, is that the mayor is the boss of all of the department heads, and that the mayor is the unifying force. And if the HR director finds that a department head is not being reasonable in their application of the code, they can say to the mayor, "Mayor, we have a problem." And then the mayor can do what the mayor does, which is ensure that his department heads are applying the code equitably and properly. And so, yes, there is an argument that it should be the HR director who is from a separate department and may not know the individual and the circumstances in the same way, which is a plus or minus, but we have framed it in a way that it lands at the hands of the department head of the supervising department in consultation with the HR director. Again, we're talking about 6 people a year in a big year, or 2 people. We're not talking about a massive wave of people. And if you go back historically, you'll see that those numbers don't go up more than that. And so I just want everyone to understand.
Mr. Volan?
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate the, I guess, the intention to shift more to like a hands-on healthcare model. I really think the municipality is in a place right now where we do need to do everything we can to retain employees. And when we're talking about extra time necessary, on behalf of HR or on behalf of department heads, what is the value to keeping an employee who is already trained in their position, comparing that to automatically firing somebody and then having to recruit and retrain. And I mean, we've had a lot of conversations about how hard it is for people even to apply to get hired. I'm thinking back to when we had the work session with our former colleague who is our interim member, Joey Sweet. He was saying, well, I applied to work for the municipality and I couldn't even get an interview. And so I think we have a lot to fix sort of on that end. And I know you all are working very hard on that and kind of going back through maybe that criteria that automatically screens people out. But yeah, I just think when we're operating in the health department, for instance, at 34% vacancy, it's kind of like beggars can't be choosers, And then when we are desperately trying to recruit firefighters and, they're being screened out for, drug testing that maybe is, conflicting or is not the best evidence. And I don't know. I just think I want to have a posture where we're willing to work with our existing municipal employees, direct them to the resources that they need, and just stay staffed up as much as possible in a way that doesn't compromise safety.
Mr. Cross?
Yeah, I support this in the aspect that, we made marijuana a legal substance for you to use at home. And I don't think we should be punishing people for participating in a legal recreational activity as long as it's not at work. And the analogy I gave yesterday was, if it's legal and you're doing it off work, why are we punishing people? You may not agree with the fact that I have a bunch of firearms, but the fact, as long as I don't bring them to work, my job's not at risk here. It's a legal activity. The only thing I have regarding the testing, I think it is important to note here, although, by the way, how awesome that we have so few positive tests. It is increased though, because you said 1 in 19, 2 in 20, 0 in 21, and then 6 in 22. So it's, although they're low, I am a little concerned that we went from normally only seeing 1 to 2 to 6 in 1 year. Now, and I believe that we have an appropriate response. And so that's something to keep in mind. They are low, but we're seeing a 600% increase in 1 year, even if it's only 6. So, and the other part of this that I really liked, and of course we did this at the last assembly meeting, is that how we're handling diluted tests is that the individual has an option to take an alternative form, be it blood or or saliva. If you're training for the fire department, training for the police, you're exercising regularly, you're drinking tons of water, you get a diluted test, you shouldn't be punished for that. There should be alternatives. So I also like that that's in here as well. So just some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to have a couple comments as well. I would be interested in the 10-year analysis of the report, the incidents of substance abuse testing, and just a footnote. The 6 is the totality of all subject testing for matters. So it's not just cannabis. Is that accurate?
Yeah, can I clarify a couple things about that? Because it's my mission to be transparent with you. So I'm not here to really advocate on certain issues. First of all, in that year where we went to 6, we also went to 298 tests, and it was a big snow year, right? So there are other drivers here that generate tests, right? And I want to be transparent about that. Second thing is that because it's post-accident testing, it's the full panel. So it's not just cannabis, it's the full panel. It captures Schedule 1, Schedule 2, all those things, because what we've chosen to do, and I think the new legislation suggests the exact same thing, is we use the same panel for covered as non-covered. So we're operating off the traditional standard DOT panel, which they have updated once in a while, but not too often. It's not annually that DOT updates the panel. So it's the same panel. It covers all that stuff. It's not just marijuana, and there are other drivers that drive accidents that in turn drive testing, right? So I think we have to be mindful of that. So.
Yeah, and that's why the 10-year analysis is going to be, I think, helpful to kind of get an understanding. And I'm actually interested in the comparable numbers with respect to incidents of alcohol abuse. Is alcohol part of the basic test that you've just described, or is it another classification of another incident reporting, and are there different numbers there, or is that included in what you just described as well?
Just a moment. I might be able to answer that question really quickly.
Cool. Mr. Constant?
One point of clarification, and I think it might be a drafting error on our part. You spoke to the idea that for covered and non-covered, we would be using the same panel, and that is true, except for the non-covered for THC, just with that clear caveat that would be the only deviation from the federal standard for those in the non-covered who for cause or accident had to test.
Correct. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to
it's actually a
overgeneralize
drafting
that.
issue.
Yeah.
We realized it this morning that we just need one little more phrase in that section to be explicitly clear.
So I just checked with Raylene to make sure. Yes, the numbers also included alcohol testing. So we are apparently picking up 0 alcohol. So at least in that big snow year in 2022.
Which is amazing because it drove a lot of us to want to drink.
And if we look at the alcohol sales tax, it did. the return of the tax was up, right? The number of revenue. I just wanted to highlight that. I'm really, one of the things that's interesting to me is the way we think about fairness, and the way fairness is measured in proximate use, right? So the idea that how we really get a handle on using on the job in a very proximate way, physically on the job, versus, to Mr. Cross's point, in the privacy of your own home, following the laws of our community. So, and it's not often that we are having discussions around things that have been voted on by the public, right? And so that's another part of this in terms of how we come along, I was just talking with Mr. Constant. We're about to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the legalization by the voters' will in the municipality of Anchorage. And so really making sure that we're coming alongside that with code that lives up to both the changes in state and federal law, but also to the will of the public, I think is just important that we've taken this on. And to hear from various units of the municipality who see this as a positive step forward, I think is exciting. And it's very meaningful work, to the point that Mr. Volan mentioned as well, in terms of recruitment, retention, and just the brand of the municipality. Any other members? Member Braga?
So I don't know who all is included in the CDL license. That would be the one that you would have mandatory random. And is it just bus drivers? But I was thinking of the people who operate large pieces of equipment. Are they CDL as well? And then you said fire department would be exempt, but I'm thinking of those huge ladder trucks and.
Let me speak to that briefly because it is an area of interest. The federal law provides an exemption process for fire services because they operate unique equipment and they aren't subject to, if the state doesn't want the requirements of the CDL. So the state of Alaska has opted into the exemption. The exemption does not require the same testing as would be under the CDL program. Therefore, the folks who operate the fire equipment are not covered. And there are jurisdictions across the country, including Vancouver, Washington, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and a number emerging, who have allowed these individuals for a number of other reasons, which we really don't have time to get into, but I'd be happy to share some thoughts. And we brought a firefighter here today because we knew this question would come up.
So if we could have, we're just almost at time. Would you like to have?
Can we extend just 5 or 10 minutes, you folks? Yeah.
Yeah.
There's nothing else in this room, so. Please.
Excellent. We'll extend a few minutes there. Would you like to invite?
Ms. Mack. Okay. Please introduce yourself for the record, and you have the floor.
My name is Justin Mack, Vice President of the Anchorage Firefighters Local 1264. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I felt like it was important to have at least one representative of the employee group that would ultimately be impacted by this new legislation. I think one of the big takeaways that's important for me and for our members is Alaskans' sort of desire for personal liberties and this right to privacy that we all appreciate about living in Alaska. And I think that's an important consideration. I think a lot of people who voted for legalization of marijuana were folks who never intended to use marijuana, but certainly respected the individual right to choose whether or not they wanted to use marijuana. I'm a strong advocate that impairment at the workplace, I think I could speak for any work group, is completely unacceptable. And a robust system needs to exist that has checks and balances, that respects the individual, respects the employer, but also respects the community that we're all here to serve. So there should be a drug testing policy, but we should also look at legalization across the state. And as mentioned many times in here, make sure that our policies fall in line with the wishes of the voters. Speaking to Assembly Member Brawley, was it Brawley or Bronca who asked about the driving? I'm sorry. I was behind the pillar over there. So like Chair Constant had mentioned, several departments across the country have already addressed this. I don't think that what we're doing with this policy is breaking new ground by any means. Several locals across the country have implemented policies that look at a lot of the similar things that we're looking at here today, which is how we do post-accident drug testing, the thresholds that we create to make sure we're falling in line. And at the forefront of all this is definitely keeping the interest of the community at the forefront. And so, as Chair Constant said, we are not CDL drivers. We do go through a training process. But with that being said, impairment in the workplace is a huge concern. It's why we have post-accident drug testing policies in the first place. We think that the updated policies for post-accident drug testing are both in line with federal standard, but also reflective of where we are today. The $500 damage limit from, I believe someone mentioned it was 1999. Obviously, a lot's changed since 1999 price-wise. So to have something that's a little bit more tangible in identifying who is actually required to do post-accident testing. As somebody who's gone through the post-accident testing process, I mean, I think in a no-fault accident, somebody ran a red light, and I was involved in an accident on a fire apparatus. The testing policy for me, although I didn't get cited, the vehicle was damaged to the point where it was towed away. In that scenario, were it to happen under this new policy, there would still be a drug test, post-accident drug test involved. And I think that really speaks to the interest of the community to make sure that there are checks and balances, this sort of trust but verify when it comes to respecting the individual's personal freedoms off duty, but also verifying that those things aren't creeping into the workplace or having a negative impact on the community that we all serve.
Thank you, Mr. Mack. Mr. Constant?
HR, you want to, any last comments?
Sure. We ask that you be mindful of the time we're going to need to implement. There'll be training programs. There may be some budget items. Obviously, if we're going to be more engaged in treatment, we're going to have to build that capacity. We don't currently do that right now. I've already said what the administration feels about the more elegant solution. I would ask you keep that in mind because we think that would be a good way to start out. And then on the supervisory thing, I think I agree with everything you said. That is the mayor's discretion. We'd like to have the legislation reflect that by leaving silent who determines what does there. It's not HR that currently makes that decision. We make it in concert with the operating department. But I think that leaving that silent might be a better alternative because that leaves the authority with the executive, and then they can make whatever determinations they want to about how that's going to be done. Because I don't think we want to get into the scenario where we have to wait to have the argument because somebody did it or didn't do it. So I'd like that left silent. Kent, is there anything else you'd like me to touch on? All right. Okay. Really appreciate the opportunity to participate. we'll try and get you that 10-year look back on the post-accident testing. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Member Braun?
Well, I just spotted something that would be good to ask you. So on page 15, it says Exhibit A at the top. Number 3, if the accident resulting in damage to municipal or private property was caused by a public safety employee operating within standard operating policy guidelines, the requirement for post-accident testing may be waived by the command officer for APD or for health and safety officer for AFD. I'm not really comfortable that if someone is in an accident that the AFD safety officer could waive the
So I
testing.
can speak to that briefly. If you look, Exhibit A is the current code that we're repealing, and it's not included in the updated code proposal.
My bad, sorry.
Because, no, we share that concern, that it just does, it seems unreasonable. And so it did not make it into the final version. So the final that you have in front of you.
So good catch and right on. Excellent. We're gonna move to the close now, but I'd turn it over to Chair Constance for some final remarks.
Yeah, thank you. So, Mr. Andrews, would you please email your comments to us so we have them fully, so that we can, as we work over the weekend towards a substitute version, take as much as we can into the package. It would be very helpful to have that.
Yes, I'll just forward that to you.
That'd be great. And then
Yep.
working through the document, there are a couple of things to note. There's some scrivener's details that have to be fixed on page 4B3. We're going to add the procedures that will be used to test for substance misuse, protect the employee or applicant and the integrity of the drug testing process, safeguard the validity of the results, and ensure the test results are attributed to the correct employee. We're also going to add, and their privacy is protected, because there's no real consideration for the privacy of the workforce here. And so we're going to add a little there. We may slightly reorganize a couple of items. We're going to have a conversation about the breadth of the test. They're going to add a section on training. And if you have any suggestions or thoughts that come up, I would ask that you email Mr. Hurt, and we are going to get a final substitute version available soon. So that's the plan.
And with that, thank you for your time, everyone. This work session is adjourned.